To buy or rent, many are facing this dilemma given the current state of the housing market. We have high prices, high interest rates, high rents. Before we get into the numbers, let's take a look at some of the pros and cons of home ownership. I can do this for renting as well, but they're pretty much going to be the inverse of each other. So let's start with the pros. So number one is obviously building equity. So with every payment that you make, a part of that payment will go towards interest, but the other part goes towards equity, towards the principal. This is building ownership in the home until it is completely paid off. So at the end of your term, whether it's 15 years, 30 years fixed, it could be an adjustable rate mortgage, you are going to quote unquote own the entire equity or 100% equity of the home. Number two is it's stable, so stability. There are no surprise increases in rent or being forced to move on a whim. There's other things that come with renting that may come on a whim as well, but typically when you own the home, you are in more control, which is number three. So you can do mostly what you want to the home outside of any HOA or municipality rules, but typically the way you want to design your house on the inside and out, the way you want to improve it, things you want to do to it, you are in control as the home owner. And then number four is that it's a forced savings account in the worst case scenario. So if you aren't a disciplined saver, but you are a disciplined mortgage payer, every mortgage payment that you make builds equity, which we talked about in number one. So this could be looked at as a forced savings tool over time. So on the other side of the coin, let's take a look at some cons of home ownership. So number one are the upfront costs. So depending on how big your down payment is, your closing costs, the different types of insurance and ongoing things that you have to pay, these upfront costs can be higher than expected. They may or may not be significantly higher than the first or last month's rent if you do decide to rent an apartment, for example. Number two is that you are less mobile. So it's harder to just pick up and leave if you need to on a whim. Say, for example, you need to move for a job, you need to move for some other family issues, getting closer or further away from family. You are definitely going to be less mobile when you own the home and it is your primary residence. Number three is that we have ongoing maintenance and ongoing costs. So we have things like upkeep, things that are breaking, a roof, property taxes, insurance, things like that. So ongoing money going into this home ownership piece is definitely a con in my opinion, as opposed to renting where the landlord may or may not take care of most of those things. And then number four, this is an interesting one when we think about it. Not recently, but historically, sometimes certain geographical areas may not appreciate. So home prices have at least typically kept up with inflation over time, but it's not always a guarantee that home prices will always go up. So if we look at post 2007 or 2008, for example, this could mean that it will take a while for you to build equity in your home if prices went down significantly. But in order to make a fair comparison, we need to boil this down to the argument that the overall monthly cost of ownership versus renting is going to be apples to apples. So if owning a home costs less than renting, then from a math perspective, it's obviously the better decision. The fairest way to look at owning a home versus buying a home is through the lens of how much money will I never see again if I make this decision. So if your rent is $2,000 a month, you're never going to see that $24,000 per year ever again. That $2,000 per month is not building equity towards an asset that you can own or sell in the future. So what are some of these home ownership line items that fall under this category of never seeing this money again? So we have property taxes, maintenance, and mortgage payment. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Marko, I understand these first two I'll never get back for the most part, but the mortgage payment, isn't that building equity towards my home that I can then sell for a higher amount later? Well, this is actually going to be considered cost of capital, and we're going to break that down in two different ways. But let me get through these first, and I'll show you the percentages and the numbers, and that way we can make an educated decision. So first is property taxes. The average effective property tax rate in the U.S. is 1.11%. As an example, the median real estate tax paid in the United States overall was $2,971, while the median home value was $268,800. So this makes the effective property tax rate for the United States 1.11%. Of course, some areas of the country are higher or some areas are lower, but since we're just using this number as an example, let's adjust accordingly for where you live. So on a $500,000 home, that's the example that we're going to be using for the rest of this video, you're going to pay somewhere in the neighborhood of $5,500 per year. Okay? Sorry, that my handwriting's terrible, but the general rule of thumb for maintaining a home is to save 1% to 2% of your home value per year on ongoing maintenance. So if we use 1% of this $500,000 home, that's obviously going to be $5,000 per year. So some of you may be thinking, hey, this sounds too high, especially if you use 2%. Again, I'm using 1. But if you think about the long term, if you think about things like roofs, boilers, HVAC, all the things that can go wrong, upgrades, all that stuff, I think $5,000 per year on a $500,000 home is fair. So if we use the lower end estimate, we're gonna end up at $5,000. Now, number 3 is where I wanna break this down on a completely new slide, and it'll make a lot more sense when I do so. But the way I'm breaking down mortgage payments is the cost of capital and the cost of debt. So you have the opportunity cost and the cost of debt. So what do I mean by cost of capital? So if I were to put 20% down on this $500,000 home, that's going to be $100,000. So I don't need to do that, but if I do want to stick to the rule of thumb of 20% down, I can. Obviously, some down payments are significantly lower. So we're going to finance how much? If the house is $500,000, I'm putting $100,000 down. That means I'm going to finance $400,000, okay? So the remaining loan of $400,000 will be taken out at a fixed rate for 30 years. That is our mortgage. Now, let's break this down on a new slide where it's completely clean and you can see where my reasoning comes from. So if we take that $100,000 down payment, that's our opportunity cost, right? We could have taken that $100,000 and done whatever with it. We could have taken trips to Cabo, we could have went to the Maldives, we could have put it all on black at the casino, or we could have invested every single penny into the S&P 500 for the last 30 years. Metaphorically, that $100,000 is going into the walls of your home and not another investment. So say we did decide to rent and we put that $100,000 into the S&P 500. So for the last 30 years, before inflation, the S&P 500 has returned 9.67%. Residential real estate from March of 1992 to March of 2024, the same 30 years essentially, is coming back at 5.5% growth annually, okay? That's for the entire country. So if I just round these up to 10% and 5.5%, that's a difference of 4.5%. So I'm taking what I could have made in the S&P 500 at 10%, just for this example. I'm subtracting 5.5%, the growth of residential real estate annually, and that's going to give me a 4.5% difference. So how do we account for that with our down payment? So if I subtract those two, I multiply the down payment, the $100,000, by 4.5%. That's the difference between the S&P 500 that I got renting or the 5.5% annual growth rate if I were to own a home, multiplying it by the difference, giving me $4,500, okay? Now, what about the loan? We still have the $400,000 that we financed, right? That's our mortgage. So if I do the same thing, I have $400,000 multiplied by 7%. So what is this 7%, Marco? The 7% is essentially the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage that you can get right now at the time of this recording. So that's why I'm multiplying the financed amount by 7%, which is going to get me roughly $28,000 a year in interest. That interest is what I'm paying the bank, and I'm never going to get that money back, right? That's the cost of borrowing capital. So if I add all these things up, the $4,500 plus the $28,000, okay, the opportunity cost plus the cost of debt, I'm going to get $32,500, and then I divide that by the price of the home. Remember, the home is $500,000, which gets me to 6.5%. So why is this 6.5% important? I'm going to show you in the next slide when I recap everything and come up with our rule of thumb for renting versus buying. Okay, so let's get to our rule of thumb, which is going to be, spoiler alert, no, actually I'm not going to say it. Let's actually go through the numbers. So if we recap, again, making an apples to apples comparison of money that we're quote unquote never going to get back, just to make a fair comparison, we have property taxes at 1.11%. I just rounded to $5,500. Maintenance 1%, $5,000. Cost of money, cost of capital, 6.5%. We just figured that out in the last slide, which is $32,500. Gives us a total of $43,000, okay? We're going to divide that by the price of the home, which is what? $500,000, and that gets us to this, 8.61%. Okay, so why is this number important? How do we actually apply this rule, okay? So if we use this formula on, say, a $400,000 house, let's multiply 400,000 times 8.61%. That's going to give us $34,440. This is the hypothetical annual cost of home ownership for that $400,000 house based on these percentages. So if you divide that number by 12, you get $2,870. I'll write this down just so you have a visual. So $2,870. So if it's cheaper to rent a comparable home in your area, let's say a $400,000 house, how much is it going to cost to rent? Then you know you're making a well-informed, good decision, right? You're not just licking your finger, sticking in the wind, and making a huge life decision on whether you're going to rent or buy. You're actually making an informed decision based on numbers. So what I would suggest you do is that you want to adjust these numbers for the area that you live in. So if you know property tax is 0.5% or 1.5%, you would obviously adjust that accordingly. If you know that maintenance is going to be a little bit higher, say it's a 100-year-old home or a historic home, for example, that you want to buy, you know that you can bump it up to 1.5 or even 2%. And then the cost of capital is pretty much going to be the same all across the board, depending on the time you watch this video. So you want to change that equation from 7% interest rates to whatever the average 30-year fixed is at that time. So there's a lot of assumptions that went into this, okay? We talked about percentages for maintenance. We talked about different costs of capital, things like that. So it can be overly simple. So let's talk about that. We're assuming that the potential renter was going to invest 100% of that $100,000 down payment if they choose to rent. So I brought this up earlier, but some people may take that $100,000 and go on vacation, buy a car, splurge on some unnecessary items, right? We also oversimplified the 7% interest cost by keeping it a flat $28,000 per year in interest. In reality, if you look at this amortization table, a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, they work on what's called an amortization schedule. So over time, more and more of your payment is going to go towards the principal rather than interest. So mortgages are interest heavy in the beginning, and then they gradually become equal and then skew towards more equity or more payments going towards the equity than interest over time. And then also the third point is that not everyone's going to take out a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. We have adjustable rate mortgages. We have 10-year fixed rates, 15-year fixed rates, 20-year fixed rates. I'm just using 30 because that's typically the most common term that people choose. Okay, so now that you understand the main factors that go into home ownership, where your money is either metaphorically stuck in the walls of your home as equity or spent on items that will never come back like property taxes or maintenance, you can make a more informed apples to apples decision. You also need to consider how long you're going to live in that property. So if you're someone who's moving for work frequently, then renting is probably going to make more sense for you. There's other aspects like raising a family, stability. So all in all, I hope you got a lot of value out of this video. This is more of a quantitative way than figuring out if you want to rent or buy than it is a qualitative way, less emotional. If you got value from this video, please hit the subscribe button for more videos like this and have a prosperous day.